It's Ray Farrell from TSN and the Ray and Dregs Hockey Podcast. I was going through some stuff and I realized there's another podcast out there, The Hockey Minute.
Burrow steals, cutting in, shoots, scores! They've slayed the dragon!
Really? Another hockey podcast? Another podcast in general? And is it a minute long or is it like a full podcast?
And over the line, he's made, going in on goal, he shoots, he scores!
Oh my goodness.
Is that Paul Correa?
Yes, it is.
Paul Correa leveled.
My. This is the first open ice big hit that Scott Stevens has thrown in the series. Paul Correa landed on his back and didn't move.
And the fans on their feet because Paul Correa has just come back from the dressing room and onto the bench. Into the zone, Sikora kicked it out, got it back near side Correa. Correa, the fans want one. Score!
I really can't get behind this idea. What the hell do you know about hockey? And who is the Hockey Minute? Who? Anybody. Anybody know?
Curry, McSorley, to Gretzky! Scores! He did it! He did it! The greatest goal scorer in National Hockey League history!
Find out. Listen. Check it out. It's only going to take a minute. It won't take that much time. I'm going to check it out. I'm going to see if this podcast is any good.
The golden goal!
But do you even know how to skate?
And after 22 years, Raymond Mark!
Be well, Hockey Minute. Be well, Brandon. Later.
All right. Joining us is Harman Dayal of The Athletic. Harman is the Canucks beat reporter with emphasis on analytics and video. Harman, man, thanks so much for doing this. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's all good, man.
We were joking that I think you'd botched your first intro take, and then I was joking that anytime I would run a podcast, I would botch and just kind of stumble over my words anytime I would do my podcast intro. And then now how funny is it that I stumbled over trying to say thanks for having me on? So
it's all good, man. I guarantee I will screw up at least 3 of the next 4 questions. So let's get right into it. I figured we'd start with the Canucks talk, and the Canucks coming off a win last night against the Habs. But I want to talk about JT Miller playing center. He finally looks good. Compared to what he's looked like for the rest of the year. But how do you see the team handling EP40 coming back? Do you think they have the depth to move Miller or to keep Miller at center, or are they going to have to keep him back on the wing?
Yeah, that's something that I've been grappling with, just because when you do bring Pettersson back into the fold, it's really appealing, the idea of having Pettersson, Horvat, and Miller all playing center. That gives you a high-end scoring threat on every line in your top 9. The only issue is, as you mentioned, I'm not sure that Vancouver's winger depth is deep enough to sustain that kind of combination. Long term, you'd have to rely on Adam Gaudette probably in your top 6, which good for him. He scored last night, and I think he's due for a lot better luck given all the chances that he's been able to create. But I'm not sure that he's a top 6 winger for you full time. Yeah. You'd obviously be relying a ton on Nils Höglander, and he's had an awesome season. Great for him. But I'm not sure if you really want to lean on him in sort of a top line role, just because I feel that when you have a rookie, unless you know he's a superstar talent right away, it's probably best to allow him to gradually work up the lineup. And so I'd actually prefer to have Höglander not have so much pressure and expectation on him in that kind of a top flight role, even though he's doing really well there right now. And then beyond that, once you move Miller to center, I look at that left wing depth and I'm like, okay, you've got Pearson as your best left winger then it really thins out after that. So from that perspective, last night we had to see a line with Sutter, Michaelis, and Best, for instance, when Travis Green hit the blender. So obviously that was with Pettersson out of the lineup. and that was just another look that they went to. But I just look at the team's winger depth, and as much as I like the idea of keeping that experiment going with Miller at center, and hey, maybe that's an option you go to if when Pettersson rejoins the lineup and Pettersson and Miller are playing together, let's say, maybe they don't, maybe they don't click, for instance, and you can go back to you can try Miller, Pettersson, and Horvat each centering their own line as a secondary look to see if things can click that way. But I'm not sure that that's the default option I'd go to.
Can you ever see anything kind of crazy like putting Bo on the wing for a game?
See, the one that I've actually seen floating around that kind of perked my interest was Pettersson at wing, because he obviously spent most of his time in Sweden before coming over to the NHL, at least when he was playing that final year in the SHL, on the right wing, I believe. So that kind of complicates things because Besser also plays the right side, but there's been that kind of suggestion, especially because you do have, we've seen recently anyway, if Miller and Besser are clicking and can kind of drive their own line, then who knows, Pettersson and Horvat could be something interesting, and you'd finally see Horvat get a real top six help on his line, and obviously that Horvat line hasn't really been going over the last 3 or 4 weeks, and I think that's been the biggest issue for the Canucks this season. Is for most of it, you've only really had one line going at any given time. In the first 10 games or so, 10, 15 games, the Horvat line was producing, but then the Pettersson one was really struggling. Pettersson wasn't producing. Miller had his slow start. And then as that Lotto line started to turn the corner, the Horvat line stopped producing. Like, I think Pearson's got what? I can't even remember the exact number off the top of my head, but he's only got a few points in the last, I think, 15 games or so. And Horvat has scored on the power play, but his 5-on-5 scoring just hasn't been there consistently enough over the last 15 games or so. And through it all, we know the bottom six hasn't been contributing much. So to really right this ship, you're going to need at least to have both top six lines going. And for that to happen, at least the fact that you've seen Miller successful at center, it for Travis Green opens up the array of possibilities and gives you a lot more flexibility to try different things and just to see whatever sticks. So that's at least an encouraging sign, regardless of what specific look they go for when Pettersson does immediately return to the lineup. Just knowing that you have a bunch of different options you could go to if the first one doesn't stick.
And it's nice seeing JT Miller engaged like he was last year. Like, I think a lot of Canucks fans were starting to worry that maybe what they saw last year was an aberration, right? It was going to be a career year, and we were going to see more of the emotional negative side of JT Miller kind of leaking into his game like we've seen through the early parts. But maybe this kind of jumpstart is what they need, and they can kick him back to the wing, and you'll still keep that kind of engaged attitude. But you touched on him a little bit just a minute ago, but what have you made of Adam Gaudette's year so far? I mean, I know he's struggling to put up any offense, but the effort is certainly there.
100%. You're always going to get the work rate out of him. That's one thing that I always appreciate, and definitely think he's been unlucky in terms of the number of chances he's created offensively and how many have actually found the back of the net. He's clearly been snake bitten here. So I do expect some positive regression in terms of his offensive production. That said, I do look at, for me, it's not necessarily about Gaudette's offensive game. For me, the question has always been about what's the next step in terms of his two-way profile. And that's where I still think that as a play driver, someone you can trust on both ends of the ice, he's still a work in progress. I think the fact that he's now being moved to the wing for Vancouver's long-term plans isn't ideal. I think it's clear at this point that, like, I completely understand why the Canucks moved him to wing, because he doesn't have the two-way skill set to handle the responsibilities of playing center. But in the organization's long-term interests, I mean, they now really clearly need a third-line center to build for the future, where you've got Pettersson and Horvat. That's going to be your backbone, but Brandon Sutter's going to be UFA. And, you don't want to rely on him in that kind of a role for any longer than this season. And what the Canucks really need is kind of a matchup center that can sort of take some of the burden off of Horvat, that can kill penalties, and can just sort of consistently help drive play and then chip in with some secondary offense. Almost do the kind of role that, and I know he's having a really good year this year in a higher capacity, but almost the role that like a Joel Eriksson would play for the Minnesota Wild, and in that kind of sort of shutdown role.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's clear that Gaudette's 2A game isn't going to progress enough to the point where he can fulfill that kind of a role. I remember coming into the season talking to Jim Benning, they were sort of seeing if they could grow that part of his game, get him to kill penalties, but doesn't seem like that's in the cards right now. And so just that positional switch, I think, does minimize his long-term importance to this team. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. And I think right now it's going to be incumbent on Gaudette to sort of establish what exactly is his identity at the NHL level, where as a winger, he's going to have to show that he's more than just the next Sam Gagner, right? Where Sam Gagner would be that sheltered scoring player who could help you on the power play, was a bit of a defensive liability. And you've seen how he kind of floats around through teams all over the NHL. He hasn't really found a consistent landing spot. And that's because teams look at a guy like him, like a guy like Gagner, and say, he's got a good level of skill here. He can help you on the power play, but he's not skilled enough to play in your top six, and he doesn't really have the other elements that we want to see out of a typical bottom six player. So that's where I think you still need to see Adam Gaudette's game kind of round out. I think cutting down on the neutral zone turnovers, just in terms of defensive zone reads, all those things I think are going to be important for him to really stick it as a long-term piece for this franchise. More important than the offense, which I think is only a matter of when, not if.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good analysis on his game. And just the one thing I've noticed, though, with moving him to the wing is that, I mean, just the way that the game has evolved, we're generally seeing larger wingers for the board battles and a more diminutive center. And he's having struggles with keeping his weight on and kind of winning those board battles. So they've thrust him into a position that he's a little bit weaker in.
Yeah, and this has obviously consistently been something that he's tried to work on. And I guess the hope would be, if you're the Canucks, that we heard from Gaudette, I think it was at training camp, where he had a stomach issue that was preventing him from being able to bulk on and add a little bit of size. And when you look at Gaudette's frame, he's average height. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think he's at least 6 feet. Mm-hmm. And so it's always kind of been that he's a little bit slight, a little bit too lean for his height. And so I think once he can, not now with that realization of what the issue was, he can hopefully bulk up a lot easier, sort of gradually increase strength. I know with this crazy schedule, he's not going to be able to do it mid-season, right? So that's perhaps something that over the offseason could be a little bit of help. But yeah, I mean, it's areas like puck battles. It's being able to get, with a guy like Gaudette, it's being able to win that battle in your own zone that helps you get the puck out. It's being able to when you are carrying the puck to the neutral zone, having a strong enough stick to be able to hang on to it and not be stripped of it in a compromising position. It is just generally being able to be really involved in the play. And I think a lot of the physical elements of Gaudette's game, I think we've seen that his skating is there. It's now about being able to become stronger, and then also just mentally how quickly he reads plays and how he processes what's going around him. It sometimes feels like, and I think it was really evident in the playoffs, where the play almost the pace of the play can sometimes be a little bit quick for Gaudette in terms of how he's making decisions defensively. He can sometimes seem like he's struggling to tread water without the puck. And I think those are just the areas that he needs to hone in on to really be a long-term difference maker for this franchise.
Just when you were talking earlier about the three center hole for the Canucks, and I was just, as you're talking, I was thinking that doesn't sound like a rookie player coming in. Like, I know people are pretty upset about Tyler Madden being shipped out for Tyler Toffoli, playing 7 games or whatever he played for the franchise. But I still don't think Tyler Madden is kind of the solution for this team, even if he were still a part of the franchise. It seems like they're going to have to look outside for some kind of veteran presence.
Yeah, I mean, Madden wouldn't have been, maybe in the long term,
Yeah.
because he definitely has play center, and I really do like his offensive tools. But yeah, I mean, he wouldn't have been ready, I think, for that kind of responsibility as soon as next season.
Hmm.
But yeah, no, I think the third line center has to be one of the top priorities for this team coming into the offseason, because it's not just that sort of hole in a vacuum. It's the fact that if you're able to find the right third line center, then that's almost the key to unlocking Horvat's game,
Hmm.
where you're able to free him up offensively. The talk going into this season was maybe Pettersson's line can take on a lot more of the tough matchups, and then from that point onward, you're able to free up Bo, and now he's got Hoglander, and so maybe there's something there to where he could be a lot more free offensively. But that really hasn't manifested. We've still seen Bo get the toughest matchups, and I think just having a third line that can sort of take some of that pressure off, while still being able to tread water, would then just free Horvat up to be a bigger difference maker at 5-on-5, especially if you could pair him with some legitimate top six wingers. So I think that kind of player is just so important for this team, where the only reason we've seen Sutter and Beagle both in the lineup at the same time is because they don't have enough penalty killing centers. And
Right.
so that sort of upgrade that you would have, I mean, even if you have an average third line center kind of coming into the mix, that's just such an upgrade for this team in terms of what it would represent in upgrading the bottom six and just transforming it so that you don't have two lines at the bottom end of your roster that get caved in all the time. So
Yeah.
definitely needs to be a top priority for the club.
Yeah, just to kind of back up what you were saying, that for the season, Bo Horvat sitting at about 39% offensive zone starts. So he's definitely still kind of that guy for the team. But just in terms of PK tools that the team has to deploy, is that why Antoine Roussell is still in the lineup primarily? I mean, he's not really bringing anything else to the game other than his PK ability.
100%. It's really only that. That's become Roussell's only redeeming quality. And I think as soon as you see Tyler Mott ready to come back to the lineup and he'd kind of slot into that PK role, you'll probably see, or at least I'd like to see, Roussell, that just be a direct exchange, Mott for Roussell, because the look that Jace Howerlick has given them, I think he's been a good difference maker for them on the fourth line, where his work rate, his engine has been running hot. He's creating havoc on the forecheck. He's got some at least average puck skills, which is what you want to see out of a fourth liner too. So I've really liked what he's brought to the table, and I think especially the last couple of games, that fourth line has done a much better job of spending more of its shifts in the offensive zone and not getting caved in. So I definitely want to see Howerlick stick in the lineup for now. And Michaelis, maybe you want to swap out. I mean, it's tough with Michaelis because so far I don't think that he's had the best of starts. But at the same time, it's like the expectation was that he wouldn't have a great start because here's this kid. These are his first professional games coming out of college, and he's coming in with completely cold feet, having not played a competitive game in over a year, right? So you expect him against NHL competition in his first taste, where he's coming off the taxi squad with nothing but practice time. You expect him to look tough, to look like he's kind of failing to tread water. So I mean, yeah, fair enough. You can kind of give him a look over the next handful of games to just get his feet under himself, and I do think you see redeeming qualities in terms of his skating ability to continue giving him a shot. But let's hypothetically say that he maybe that line of Michaelis, Sutter, Gaudette just isn't clicking. Then you've also got Zach McEwen in to kind of get a shot in the bottom six. And so just from that perspective, I mean, whether it's Michaelis, Gaudette, or Michaelis, Howerluck, I was meaning to say, I'd rather see those guys get a shot at that point rather than Roussell once Mott comes back from the lineup as a penalty killing piece.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny what a huge difference just changing a couple of pieces that are not getting a lot of ice time can make it on the team, right? Like putting in Michaelis and Howrluck has really kind of sped up that bottom six in a way that you probably wouldn't have predicted.
Yeah, and I think it just speaks to the value of just being able to add a bit of speed to this lineup. It's not even that Howrluck and Michaelis are plus skaters. I'd rate them as average skaters, in fact, but when they do get moving, they can move pretty well in a straight line, and I think that's just such an interesting way to it reflects just how slow the rest of the bottom is. When you look at guys like Beagle and Sutter and Roussell's always tough for me to get a gauge on, because there are some moments where his motor is really going and he's disrupting plays, but then there are others where the explosiveness in his stride just looks a little flat. But no doubt, I mean, and that's why I think the team has been so reluctant to give up on Jake Virtanen for the last year or so, is that I think they see his speed and say we don't have enough of that in our lineup. So I think anything you can do over the course of the offseason to add bottom six pieces that can control play at an efficient cap hit while also being able to add some pace to your group, I think that's really important, because especially when you look at a team like Vegas against Vancouver in the bubble, that was the biggest advantage that they seemed to have, was that they were bigger and faster, and they just seemed to physically overwhelm the Canucks in situations like the forecheck, just along board battles, and that's ultimately what allowed them to control the run of play. And I think that's the next element in terms of bolstering the bottom six.
So, I mean, the Canucks have to go something like 19-8 to make the playoffs, right? I mean, even with Demko heating up, it's extremely unlikely this year. And even if they make it as the fourth seed, I mean, let's be honest, they're not doing anything in the playoffs. So, but I mean, with that said, I'm still legitimately concerned that the Canucks are going to go on a little bit of a run here leading up to the deadline, and we're going to see the team act as buyers going in and try and acquire these assets that you're talking about. So how do you see the trade deadline playing out here for the Canucks coming up?
Right, and this was the most predictable timeline, wasn't it? The team flames out to start the season. Their playoff odds are completely down in the dumps. They need to go at something like a 120-point pace to make the playoffs. They're temporarily without their best player, so all logic would lead you to believe that the team would probably continue on the slide. But no, we're ahead of the trade deadline, so they're just going to go on this heater, this bender that's going to make them that's going to give them some false sense of hope and belief here. But no, in all seriousness, they do need to keep sight of the bigger picture here. I think, again, if you look at their playoff odds updated after these last 3 wins here, still at 6%, and you still need to play at something like 117, 118, 119 point pace to make it here. And so it's not even just that you worry about them being buyers. Forget that. They just need to sell assets, period. Where you look at guys like Tanner Pearson, and I know the team's discussed resigning him, but he's going to be 29 years old before the start of next season. I think the team's talked about, they're probably going to need 2 more years before they're actual contenders. And I don't actually disagree, just in terms of looking at the cap profile and the fact that there isn't a whole lot of flexibility that opens up this offseason. So in light of that, I mean, Pearson, you've got to sell on Sutter, Ben, Hamonic, all these pieces, anything you can do to acquire as many draft picks as you can, because those draft picks are going to be the ammunition, the currency that you can use to take flyers on guys in the offseason. With the expansion draft coming up, one of the advantages that the Canucks, or at least the silver linings, I should say, the Canucks have with Virtanen and Gaudette not necessarily lighting the world on fire, is that now you have expansion protection slots available both up front in your forward group and on the back end. So you're going to be able to target a lot of these teams that have intriguing kind of middle six pieces, and then really what you're looking to do there is find the next William Karlsson, find the next Jonathan Marchessault, find the next Eric Halla, right? And so that's what I think the Canucks are in a position to do. Take advantage of other teams' crunchy expansion situations. And to do that, you're going to need enough draft capital to make it happen. You're only going to have that draft capital if you sell at the deadline. So really, I mean, people, I know a lot of the discussion will be, oh, like you're giving up on the season. You know, what about having success in the present? Well, that makes sense. But really what we're doing here is when we're selling, it's not that, oh, we have an eye towards the future and we only really care about contending 3 or 4 years from now. It's about selling and then just directly converting those assets into pieces that can help you for next season. So and ensuring that what happened this year doesn't replicate itself. So I think if you look at all the expansion options that are going to be available, if you look at the fact that this is going to be a buyer's market and unrestricted free agency, even with the Canucks' cap constraints, they are in a position where they could pretty meaningfully overhaul their bottom 6 and kind of make significant inroads in kind of completely restructuring the bottom end of their roster and kind of building out the supporting cast if they do sort of approach these next 6 to 8 months the right way. And I think that has to be the number one priority, no matter how hot this team gets, because I just personally, I don't see them making the playoffs, regardless of the fact that they are getting on a hot streak here.
Yeah, and even with the hot streak, it reminds me of last year's Canucks team. I mean, it's on the back of great goaltending and a solid PK and a power play. Like that's what this team is right now. I mean, if they had even league average goaltending, they would be so much worse, which is incredible to think about considering where they sit positionally in the standings. So, yeah, I'm with you. But again, just as a lifelong Canucks fan, I'm just so nervous about what this next year is going to hold for this team. It's just man, it could go pretty bad. So, I mean, you kind of touched on it a little bit there, but Jim Benning had a press conference. They got a whole lot of attention locally, but none nationally. I think 31 Thoughts basically just said, more or less, we're kind of blowing it out of proportion. And what else was Jim Benning supposed to say? And, you know, I think there is a little bit of truth to that. I mean, I don't know. He's not going to sewer his own team. He's not going to say, hey, I effed up. I made these mistakes. I'm saddled with a ton of bad contracts that I signed, especially when those guys are still on the team. I mean, you can't talk about your employees that way. I think he's right in his assessment of 2 years for a real competitive window. I mean, like you're saying, just looking at the cap situation, in 2 years, most of those contracts are off the book. Louis is gone. I mean, they're still going to have Tyler Myers dragging them down, but there's not a whole lot there. But I mean, what was your take on the whole Jim Benning press conference?
Right. So I do think there's some element of truth to that. However, at the same time, I do think that the message that was sent was almost the opposite of what the fan base would have wanted to hear, right? I think you're right that you couldn't just go out there and sewer and say, oh, I effed up on building this team and I've got so many bad contracts. I mean, nobody realistically would have expected that. But to have some level of just accountability and acknowledgement that what happened this season was unacceptable, and that as the primary builder of the team, that he does feel some semblance of responsibility, and that that they have to now go and evaluate what's gone wrong, and then just go down that path, the typical GM speak almost, where most GMs, when they're in that spot, they talk about, okay, like as the team builder here, I do assume responsibility for the way this year went, and I'm going to evaluate top to bottom over the next few months, players, coaches, everyone, and just work to see what went wrong and ensure that it doesn't happen again. And so I think that's kind of rhetoric, that sort of walking down that path would have been a lot better than saying, then like right off the hop, they started throwing up these excuses about the flat cap and the pandemic and the shortened season, and we're playing in the North Division rather than the Pacific one. And I mean, I think these are circumstances that every team deals with. And so I think those excuses just kind of ring a little bit hollow for fans that have invested so much and expected the team to take a step forward, or at least just hold their own after the kind of success that they had last year. And I mean, truly, it is unacceptable for the team to have Pettersson and Hughes on their ELCs and to be capped out with a team that, to have an on ice product of this nature. And I think just anything else, anything other than throwing your hands up in the air and blaming it on everything but yourself would have kind of resonated a little bit better. Again, there would have been heat no matter what he said, right? There would have been criticism because people have made up their mind, and I can understand why one way or another on Jim Benning, but just some level of, I think, responsibility and accountability. And I mean, I just look at in Toronto, and I know people hate the Leafs, and I do agree that in the media they get, too much attention and a little bit too much adoration. But this example only comes to mind because of that all that media attention. But you look at Kyle Dubas, for instance, when the team fell short last year for them, the Leafs, he's consistently a general manager that always takes responsibility, always, even when it's perhaps not even that fair. I mean, injuries, for instance. He brought up the Pittsburgh example that the Penguins last year went through all these injuries, and so it was just, you watch any Kyle Dubas press conference, and that's a management group that always puts the onus on themselves. And realistically, if you look at any area of life, like forget being a GM of a hockey team, you can only really make sustainable changes and improve on yourself and improve the processes if you take responsibility for your actions. And I think if your first inclination, and this goes back a long time with this management group, where usually it would be about injuries and we don't have enough depth, and that was just the rhetoric every year. If you don't take responsibility for what you directly have control over, then you're not going to make improvements. And so from that perspective, I think that's what fans were a little bit disappointed in, especially when it came to the deadline and saying we're going to take it day by day, when a GM's role is the exact opposite. You've got to be thinking long term and much more than the day to day. The Canucks need to be proactive at this deadline, and I completely understand why a lot of the fan base has reservations and worries about how they're going to handle this deadline and beyond.
Yeah, and I think those are totally fair. Just one thing I haven't really heard mentioned too much, though, is everybody talks about firing Benning, and I'm just curious what the replacement would be. I mean, you brought up Kyle Dubas, and I'm a fan of their management office as well. But I think the fact is there's probably 2 or 3 executive offices like that in all of hockey, right? Most of those the other clubs are the old boys clubs that are going to operate in the same way, in similar fashion to Jim Benning. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't know where this is going. And again, I'm super nervous for what's going to happen. Like, are we going to get a Dean Lombardi that's going to come in and run the team the same way that Benning would run run it, right? I think that it's few and far between for those truly progressive managers.
See, that's a problem there, right? And this is where it comes down to ownership, where, again, if it's exactly as you said, if you were to move on from Jim Benning and just bring in a manager with similar philosophies and processes, then it's going to be a lateral move. It's just going to be a new voice that makes much of the same kind of decisions, which is, it's not going to be any improvement, right? And so from that perspective, if they do decide to make a move, it's incumbent on ownership to kind of dig deep here and to go through all the candidates. So look at the position that the team's in today, where you have an elite core, but you need to build a supporting cast. You're tight on the cap. And so I think some of the top skills that you need to look for out of your next manager are astute cap management, are just generally top tier asset management, where you look at a lot of the kind of pieces that the Canucks have kind of had over the years, whether it's Jake Virtanen or whoever. The organization has a tendency to kind of sell low on players rather than sell high, and so you need top tier asset management, and you're also going to just generally need to be able to identify market inefficiencies to flesh out your supporting cast. And so you look at kind of those attributes, you're not going to, in all likelihood, get those qualities from a manager that just follows the herd. And I think it was Andrew Harris from Canucks Army who mentioned it the other day, where it's like, if your process in making decisions is the exact same as 80% of the league, how can you expect to be better than 80% of the league? Right? If you're doing the exact same things, if your thought if your thought processes and philosophies and how you value traits like size and intangibles and just how you view building a contender is the exact same as most teams around the league, well, then it's how are you going to expect any results above the mean average, right? So I think that's where I'm not saying you have to bring in a contrarian, but someone who can construct a front office where there are a wide array of perspectives, because you look at this kind of front office right now, and what you've noticed is whether it's been Trevor Linden, whether it's been Judd Brackett, you're seeing dissenting voices, even with Lawrence Gilman right at the start. You're seeing smart people with different sort of perspectives and situations leaving the organization. And so there are just less and less voices at the table to where it's becoming an echo chamber there. At least, I mean, they do have other, I think, smart people in the organization for sure, guys like Jonathan Wall and Aiden Fox and Ryan Beach, but I don't know how much they listen to those guys on a day-to-day basis, right? So I think the key with any next manager you have is you're going to have to be progressive. I mean, data tracking is coming into the NHL, and if you aren't paying attention to those things, and no one's saying go out there and data is the only thing you care about, because it never should be, but you at least need to incorporate it as part of modern day player analysis rather than just relying on your gut, just relying on your emotion, because that's what's gotten the Canucks into this pickle in the first place, is relying on things like doing it completely the old way without any care to basic underlying numbers. So I think whatever they do, it's now going to be on ownership to make the right decisions. It's above just management right now.
Yeah. And what's so funny to me, I mean, funny, not funny, about this management is, I mean, Jim Benning's weaknesses are exactly as you laid out, right? It's being able to work with the cap and do these kind of creative things with the contract and CBA, which is exactly Lawrence Gilman's skill set, who they let walk. And it seems like, I mean, one of the key traits of a leader is his ability to assess where his weaknesses are and hire people that have those as strengths. And it seems like Benning doesn't want anything to do with that. And it's just, I don't know, man. it's not giving me a whole lot of hope for the future. I got one more Canucks question here for you before I wanted to transition a little bit. Alex Edler is a UFA after this year, and I think waiving him to go anywhere is obviously, or not waiving, sorry, but getting him to waive his no trade clause is an obvious non-starter. But should he actually want to return next year, I mean, what kind of contract are you offering him? Is it a 1 year, $2.5 million, something along those lines?
Yeah, it would have to be something like that. Again, when you look at Vancouver's cap situation, yes, you do have money coming off the books, but after you reallocate it to pay Pettersson, Hughes, and now Thatcher Demko too, you run pretty tight. You don't have a whole lot of flexibility to do a whole lot else. And so I think in light of that, you can't really spend much on Alex Edler, given that he's going to be another year older. And quite frankly, I just don't think that he's a high and top for a defenseman anymore. I think he can help you out on a bottom pair is like a number 5 defenseman maybe, but he shouldn't be leaned on in higher leverage minutes. And especially if the idea is now we're going to go and perhaps, let's hypothetically say it costs you $2.5 million. You know, depending on what other possibilities are out there, I don't even know if $2.5 million would be worth it. Not because Edler's not worth that, but because that $2.5 million could go towards acquiring a legitimate top 4 defenseman, which the club needs a lot more than another 4 or 5 kind of guy. So I think you almost have to prioritize things where first priority is going to be the RFAs, right? And then after that, you're going to have to look at this roster, and they're going to need a top 6 winger. They're going to need a top 4 defenseman. And so you have to address those things before you even worry about Alex Edler, because I don't think he's the solution to being your high-end high-end top 4 defenseman anymore, because he clearly has slowed down. I think there are still redeeming qualities, no doubt, in his game. And he still is bearing a lot of tough matchups, and that Schmidt-Edler pairing is actually playing really well. And so I think you almost have to view Edler as your fallback option of, if we can acquire a legit top four guy, we know we have Edler to re-sign and bring back for another year, but it's probably not your ideal sort of option to fill that hole. You probably want to be aiming a little bit higher than that.
It's kind of an indictment for the team, though, isn't it? That Alex Edler is still, I mean, you can make an argument for the third best D-man on the team, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. And I mean, it's like if you had Edler playing bottom pair minutes and just able to help you on the penalty kill, and you had him next to, say, a right-handed guy who was more mobile, right? Could really skate. Just picture Jack Rathbone, coming into the lineup next year. Let's say he was a right shot defenseman. Like that would have been such a nice pairing, right? To have Edler as your veteran steady presence to guide a young rookie who has the explosive mobility and puck moving skill set to complement Edler. Like that's the kind of pairing that, you would have loved to see. That's the kind of defenseman. If again Rathbone was right-handed, which he isn't, but that's a kind of limited role where Edler can still be really effective. But just the fact that the Canucks don't have enough defenders beyond Hughes and Schmidt that actually move the needle. It's the story of the last 5 years where Edler's still being asked to do a little bit too much.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. So just to change gears a little bit here, I know that you were mentored by the late Jason Botchford, and anybody familiar with the Canucks market is obviously familiar with his work. I mean, he was just the kind of the touchstone for so many people who were fans of the Canucks. So could you just give us a few words on what it was like working with him and just his influence on your work?
Yeah, no, it was an absolute treat and honor to have the opportunity to work with him, because I remember the first time just talking to him was after I'd written one freelance piece for The Athletic. I think it was on Vertanen and his zone entry playmaking. And, immediately he reached out and was ready to give me a ton of advice, give me a ton of help, and help me come up with future article ideas that I could write. And at the time, that Vertanen piece was only meant to be like a one-off, right? Where I pitched it. My freelance status wasn't meant to be an ongoing thing, but he kind of pushed for me behind the scenes to get that opportunity. So for him to, make that effort, and then we talk all the time about what are good ideas to write about. And again, I mean, and I'm sure this was true for a lot of people, because that's just how he engaged so many people in the market. Was we DM for, all day, every day, on Twitter, just constantly talk about the hockey team. And so I think those kind of experiences just shaped my impression of just how to view this hockey team and how to view being a reporter. And it allowed me to see his process for how he came up with ideas and how he covered the team. And so all of that just, it meant the world to me, especially given the fact that even when I went to my first practice, he was the one that guided me and mentored me in terms of walking me through the interview process, and getting familiarized with players and coaches. He introduced me, right? He introduced me to Travis Green, introduced me to Bo. And I remember that's the first article I wrote that ever had quotes in it. And so just he was able to break the ice for me in such a meaningful way there. And so, for him to have that kind of impact meant a ton to me personally. And then all that he did for everyone else, right? He was always someone who had time for anyone in the market, no matter how big or small you were. He'd go and have that conversation with you. And so from that perspective, I mean, he was just the lifeblood. He was the heartbeat of this market, and he was just able to. He was the perfect reflection of what the fan base wanted at the time, right? And he just single-handedly shaped the conversation in the market. And it's tough for me to really articulate, and I'm sure a lot of people who followed his work and followed who he was can kind of agree. It's almost tough to articulate just how much he meant to people, because it wasn't just like your typical journalist that you read, or the guy you read on radio. It's you just develop this emotional connection with him, even if you even if you weren't someone who got to interact with him personally, just from being able to listen to him, whether it was on podcast or radio, and read his work, it was such a personal connection. And that's the biggest thing, that, you know, he had that impact on not only individuals like myself, but the entire market.
Yeah, that's true, man. It seemed like he was definitely larger than life, and it seemed like his presence was greater than anybody else's presence in the media can carry. I don't know about nationally, but it just seems like he almost had this kind of rock star thing to him. But it was never about him; it was about the team, and it was just it was awesome to behold. He was by far the number one reason for me to subscribe to The Athletic. But I mean, it's guys like you and Thomas Trance that keep me coming back. So, man, Harman, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to Canucks today, and maybe just let everybody know where they could find you and your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. You can find my work at The Athletic, as mentioned, and then you can find me on Twitter at Harman Dayal 2. So that's at HarmanDayal 2. That's where you can find me.
Awesome. Well, everybody, make sure you follow Harman, and thanks everybody for listening. We'll catch you next time. All right, buddy, that was awesome. I'll just ran too long on the Canucks question, so maybe I'll get you on a little bit in the future, and we could do some analytics chat if that's good with you.
Yeah, 100% anytime.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks again, and I'll shoot you a message tomorrow when it's all live.
Sounds good. Take care.
All right, you too, buddy. Bye.